Good afternoon. It's great to be back. I think this is my second visit to Darden. I make it a point every year to visit to one of Cargill's core MBA recruiting schools, and so I tend to rotate amongst 5 core schools that Cargill recruits MBA candidates from. Certainly Darden has been very well represented over the last decade. About 30 Darden alums have joined Cargill. The vast majority are still there, and so I have a chance probably in most weeks and in some cases most days to interact with some Darden alum in my work. Emily has joined me here today, year and a half with Cargill, just coming off her one-year field assignment and in our strategy and business development group, which is what we recruit for here at Darden. The subject I've been asked to talk about today is global food security. Very surprising for us in Cargill. Basically, food has been taken for granted for a long time, and in the last 2 or 3 years it's suddenly been pushed into the mainstream media and talked about, generally with relatively poor context. And I would start by saying the world can feed itself. The number of people that are here today, the number of people that we would anticipate would come, and they can do it with the technology that's already been invented. And so clearly there's more research that will be done and more advances will be made, but we have the technology, we just don't have the deployment. And so I always like to start the conversation with, this is not going to be a horror story. It is a story about the fact that the world can feed itself, it's just elected not to do it. And a variety of reasons for having made those choices. One of the big ones that is debated most vociferously lately is the whole issue of food versus fuel or energy. So to go a little bit further back, everybody understands photosynthesis, right? Okay. If you don't nod, I will call on you to explain to your classmates. But essentially Cargill's business, and we have a financial business. We trade metals and electricity and energy and carbon credits and a lot of things. But the big core of Cargill's business, about $75+ billion of sales, is in the food space. It is the origins of the company from a small grain elevator in Conover, Iowa in 1865. And so I'll talk about the part of Cargill's business that's directly linked to the commercialization of photosynthesis. And the good news about carbon dioxide, it is the fuel for photosynthesis, but you all knew that, right? So, and we live in a world where there's a huge amount of talk about global warming and what the impact of that will be on agriculture and on climate. And clearly the two are linked. I would have said that to date, the impact of the modest warming that we have seen in the world has probably been net positive overall, but it's added a lot of volatility to the world. So how far have we come in feeding the world? In 1975, the world produced less than 1.4 billion tons of grain. With good weather, grains and foodstuffs, the 16 biggest crops. If we have reasonable weather in 2012, we'll produce 3 billion tons. Second thing is the amount of land that we use to produce that 3 billion tons versus the 1.4 billion tons that we produced in 1975 is about the same. It's gone up very modestly. And so we've doubled the amount of calories that we grow through photosynthesis, and we've done it on essentially the same number of acres of land. Now they're not the exact same acres because we have clearly had urban displacement. But it brings us to the other side of the agricultural discussion that's going on in the world, which is about sustainability and about its impact on the environment. So a couple of things that we believe, and I guess I'll make a caveat at this point. My talk will probably in the end be really a bunch of factoids, but hopefully they will give you a context and a pattern to think about feeding ourselves. So we grow twice as much food on essentially the same amount of land. We clearly have to continue to do that, or agriculture will run headlong into the expectations of society. The challenge that we have around the world is that in the absence of governments declaring which part of the world will not be used for agriculture, agriculture will continue to encroach, because poor people will always do better if they can just go take land and put it into production. And so the fact that we continue to have run-ins, whether it's in Indonesia with NGO groups or in the Amazon or in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it is really not an issue about the need for that land to come in to production, but the needs of individuals that live in those areas to feed their families through subsistence agriculture. And in the absence of their governments telling them not to do it, we will continue to see a creeping utilization of land in very extensive agricultural practices, very low productivity per hectare, very little capital investment or improvement. And so a lot of what you'll read, and certainly we'll leave plenty of time today to take your questions, is about this encroachment of agriculture into lands that people feel should be preserved for the global commons. We think both of those things can be done, and in spite of our desires, Cargill has not yet been nominated a police force for the world, and as a result of that, in a lot of cases, we're asked, including by our customers, to try to put some governance in place about where people raise soybeans in Brazil. We have agreed to only buy soybeans from people that grow on land, which through satellite imagery we can confirm, but that doesn't keep other people who sell to other processors in the industry from growing beans on land that society would prefer they not use. And so we're caught as a company in trying to be an intermediary between the behaviors in a whole host of countries, many of them where the legal institutions have not yet declared where food can be produced, and the desires of the Nestle's and McDonald's and Kraft's and Unilevers of this world to have their brands protected from criticism about where their supply chains lead. And so if you think about the long supply chains for the chocolate brownies that you're enjoying, clearly what were the age of the people that produced those crops? What were the age of the people that harvested them? What practices did they follow? What care did they give with the pesticides and herbicides that they used? All of those are things that are important to Cargill's customers, and we're expected to vouchsafe for those supply chains. In some cases we can do that. In others we can't. And the simple word picture is, even in a country as well-to-do as the United States, if there were not boundaries around national parks, people would probably graze cattle in national parks. And so this very idea, and we work a lot with the Nature Conservancy, and they have an individual that's one of their policy wonks, and he has this great expression: the world needs to declare the don'ts. Don't grow here, don't do this, but don'ts can only be enforced by governments. Clearly, companies can argue for good don't policies, and clearly powerful companies like the big branded food companies around the world have and carry more voice than a lot of others. But in the end, they can only use their voice to get the legislative and administrative behavior that controls where agriculture is going to take place. So certainly we'll take any questions about sustainability. The other issue that we get into most often is about water, and clearly that is a big issue. About a third of the world's calories are produced through irrigation. Probably half of that third are produced from water that is non-renewing. It's not coming back. They're ancient aquifers that are non-renewing or renewing themselves at a very slow rate. And so the world is not only going to have to produce more food, we're also going to have to think about where to get those calories that are currently being grown with non-renewable water. You probably don't follow, anybody follow Saudi Arabian agriculture closely? Okay. So Saudi Arabia in the 70s, really following the scare from the Russian grain deals, decided to become self-sufficient. And if you fly into Riyadh, you'll see enormous irrigation pivots in the desert, pumping literally thousands of year old water up to the surface to grow wheat, which they could readily buy from the Canadians who can grow it with rainfall. But in an effort to become self-sufficient, it's clearly very expensive food. They're wealthy enough to produce it and buy down the price for their citizenry through subsidies. And so they, in the last 2.5 years, have elected to discontinue that and said self-sufficiency is the wrong strategy. That has raised their paranoia about their food security. And so what we see in the world, really coming out of an issue about water paranoia, is leading to food security behaviors. So where are the Saudis going to get their food if they're going to quit growing it themselves in order to preserve their water? And just to put it in context, Saudi Arabia was using 18 billion cubic meters of water a year. 16 billion of the 18 billion was being used to raise wheat and alfalfa, which is ridiculous. So they were going to dissipate their water resources in a desert country at 9 times the speed they needed to support their urban water needs and their industrial water needs. And so for them, this is not just a small extension of the life of their water. This is a dramatic extension. But how are they going to feed themselves? Okay, I don't have the power of the cold call. The only person I know by name, Mr. B. So you're stuck. No. So they're going to go, in all likelihood, to Africa. And the kind of agriculture that they pursue in Africa is clearly going to have huge implications on water usage, and it's going to have huge implications on rural sociology. And so you can see in the way the links in the food chain interact that water insecurity, food insecurity, and the impact on agricultural and rural sociology in Africa are all linked together and part and parcel of the same problem. Why do I say that? Because most governments and most legislatures hate dealing with interconnected issues. They have hearings on roads one day, and they have hearings on health care the next day, and they have hearings on energy security, and they go on, and they segment all of these issues into pieces, and we end up with policies that probably contribute more to food insecurity than anybody's worry should be about adequate land mass or water. So to finish it on water, what will the Saudis do? At this point, they've bought enormous tracts of land in the Sudan. And one of the facts about the Nile is the water in the Nile has already been divided up by treaty. And so because of the civil war in Sudan, how much of their water do you think they've used? Almost none. So where did it go? Geez, where's your geography, folks? So it went to Egypt, right? And so if the Saudis start growing their food in the Sudan and they take the water they're entitled to from the Nile, it's water that won't flow into Egypt. And so then you get into the link between water insecurity, food insecurity, and geopolitics. And I point it out simply because the facts are that dealing with malnourishment is a complicated issue. So then to energy. So the world today converts about 8% of all of its grains into biofuels, which we force all of you to burn in your cars. Right? You don't get a choice. We've decided you need it. And so 15% of all the vegetable oil produced in the world is turned into diesel fuel. And so to give you some context for those numbers, back to the nearly 3 billion tons that we're going to produce. There are 1 billion malnourished people in the world. If you calculate how malnourished they are, it will take about 32 million tons of grain to feed all of them. Okay? 32 million tons out of 3 billion. Just over 1%. So we're putting 8% of all of our grains into bioethanol and 15% of all of our vegetable oil into biodiesel. But the caloric shortfall for these 1 billion people would only take about 1.5% of the world's production. So we could do both. We just decided not to do both. And so the issue that it needs to be either food or fuel really doesn't stand the test of the math. There is enough to do some of both. The problem that we have today is one of them is missized, the percentage that's going to biofuel, and the other one is clearly misallocated because we have 1 billion people that are undernourished. And so the great challenge for all of us, and I think you've probably seen some of the information about Cargill's donation of rice in the last few days to the Horn of Africa in light of the drought and the issues in Somalia. But Joe Biden made a great comment after visiting there, is the malnourishment in the world is a stain on the world's conscience. And it really is when you consider that it would only take about a reallocation of about 1.5% of the calories we produce to extinguish that malnourishment. 1.5%. This is not a tough deal. So why doesn't it happen? There's a myriad of reasons, some of them political, some not, certainly some of them economic. But one of the issues is 40% of all the malnourished people in the world are located in what two countries? Countries. China and India. Okay, so one has $2.5 trillion, and the other exports food. They'll export sugar this year. They'll export rice, certainly. The irony of the gift that Cargill has just made, because of proximity and logistics and the need to get it there quickly, the rice that we hauled to the Horn of Africa came from India. And so in a way, it's an uncomfortable irony that a country that is home to 300-odd million, 260-odd million malnourished people is the net exporter of calories, and we play a role in that, marketing those crops. And so it is a complicated issue that the world's largest holder of hard currency reserves and a country that is an exporter of calories are home to nearly 40% of the malnourished people. So the issues have a lot of facets and a lot of complication. A couple other items I would just cover and then take your questions. One is about comparative advantage. And at first coffee today, we had a conversation. So anybody that is a big fan of David Ricardo and comparative advantage will be disappointed if you join agriculture, because agriculture worldwide has made a lot of decisions about where to grow its food and how. And we could grow our food a lot more cheaply and with a much smaller environmental footprint and a much more efficient use of water if we would just do it where nature would signal us to do it based on the principles of comparative advantage. In point of fact, it doesn't happen that way at all through either subsidy or import barriers or quotas. The world's agricultural system is really an outgrowth not of comparative advantage or Mother Nature's bestowal of natural resources. It is a function of policy. In a lot of those cases, they really distort the free trade in food. So clearly, Cargill works hard through the opportunities we have to influence global policy on food trade and on the way in which it takes place. But we are not likely to feed at a price a lot of people can afford 9 billion people up from today's 7 billion people if we don't have a fundamental change in the trade policy and the exploitation of comparative advantage. That in the places where rainfall is underutilized, we need to grow more, and in the places where non-renewing irrigation water is required, we have to grow less. And of necessity, that's going to require more and better free trade policies. A cynic would say, and you can raise your hand if you were thinking it, that sounds very self-serving for Cargill, and it is, since that's what we do, is try to move crops from places that are naturally endowed to produce them to places where the population and the demand resides. That is our business model. But I think it's demonstrably a fact. It's the only way in which we can feed 9 billion people in an environmentally responsible way, is if we take advantage of what nature provides us in terms of soil and water resources. So trade policy is going to be a big part of it. Last one I'll talk about is some of the institutional necessities, and talk just in the context of Africa. That clearly the world can't feed itself and do it economically if we do not dramatically increase the production of calories in sub-Saharan Africa. It can happen. So I'll give one story that should build people's optimism, and it can be repeated over and over again, and that's Zambia. So what's Zambia's big export? Copper. What's the price of copper done? Through the roof. And so suddenly you have a country that's become natural resource wealthy. That money comes into their economy and it permeates their economy. Suddenly farmers in Zambia are able to sell crops at a profit to people that are making good money working in these mines, building the infrastructure to exploit the copper. The price rises. This year, Zambia will be a net exporter of nearly 1 million tons of corn from being a country that was a caloric deficit, all as a result, not that somebody from the United Nations showed up, not that somebody from Cargill showed up, not that they got a handout. They simply received a fair price greater than their cost of production, and lo and behold, they reinvested part of that money the next year. And we have clients whose grain we buy that have taken their yields from 1.5 tons of grain per hectare to over 5, and they've done it in 5 years. And so this is simply the deployment of technology that's already known and exploited elsewhere, and do it solely based on the signal of price. And so what we need in sub-Saharan Africa is a realization that a system of impoverished farmers who are asked in order to feed the voting urban poor at a price below which farmers can afford to grow the crops is not going to lead to the kind of agriculture that will produce enough calories. I probably said it too quickly based on the looks on people's faces. But if you're a politician and you're counting noses, what do you want? Cheap urban food. But the downside of that is you have to then buy at very low prices from the very farmers you're counting on to feed those urban populations. And so what we have observed over and over in Africa is this vicious cycle of farmers receiving too little to deploy capital to improve their performance, and the shortfalls in caloric production being made up by gifts and by donations. And in the end, that's the ultimate definition of unsustainable agriculture, the inability to pay a price that encourages people that live 40 and 50 and 100 kilometers from your own cities from producing food, and instead relying on somebody to send it to you as a gift from 5,000 and 6,000 miles away. And so we have a lot of people working in Africa, and agronomists. This year we'll make over 100,000 microloans in Zimbabwe and Zambia to try to encourage people to follow appropriate practices. But if they don't receive sufficient revenue from the crops they produce to cover those costs and encourage them to do it again next year, it too will be an unsustainable effort. And so the technology exists. It's been proven in Zambia with appropriate price signals, you can get a sustainable agriculture, i.e. farmers receiving more than the cost to produce it, and as a result creating a surplus of calories. We just have to get off this treadmill of inappropriate prices and gifts of food from far, far away as the model to feed Africa. Because if we don't do it, we will draw into global agricultural production land that will disappoint a lot of people that have environmental concerns. And so Africa is a critical linchpin to feeding the world between now and 2050, and clearly we hope to be part of that, but it is a long and steep climb. So we can do this. We've proven, we've doubled it since '75, that the resources, the technology are there, and I think what we lack at this point is the political coordination, the political will to have sufficient free trade and sufficient ground rules around governance of what areas are prohibited to agriculture to meet the needs of people's environmental concerns. And we have to become much more thoughtful about how much of our photosynthesis we convert into motor fuels. So with that, I'll stop and take your questions or your criticisms.
Do you mind speaking to Cargill's choice or no choice to go into aquaculture in the coming years? And
Yep.
how you see Cargill playing a role in that across the world?
So we have invested a lot of money in aquaculture research. We would, just as we are in most crops, we're not a big farmer. We don't own a lot of land. We don't produce a lot of crops. We're a marketer and transporter and transformer. The big challenge in aquaculture, and where we're spending most of our time, is today a lot of the feed that is fed to domesticated fish is fish meal. And that's obviously an unsustainable model. And the trick is to take vegetable-derived proteins and convert them into fish protein and not require the catching of anchovies and menhaden and other fish meal. And so feeding fish to fish as a way to solve the world's caloric requirements isn't going to work. So back to the commercialization of photosynthesis, we're trying to grow high-protein crops based on photosynthesis and convert that protein into molecules that are absorbable by fish, and to create fish without the need for fish meal. And I think that's the moment when the demand for, the price of, and the degree to which we can rely on aquaculture to feed the world is going to really improve. But making aquaculture bigger at this point, where it's feeding fish to other fish, it's a doomed loop, and so we have to get away from that, and that's where most of our energy is.
I recently read an article about lab-grown meat and stem cells, and lab-grown meat, like lab-grown steak.
Lab-grown meat, yes. Yep.
And given that production...
It's lab-grown proteins.
Sorry, lab-grown protein.
Okay.
I suppose they can't call it meat.
Oh, we will.
Given that production of meat, especially, for example, from cattle, is a very resource-intensive and expensive way to produce protein, what are your thoughts towards the future of protein sourcing, and perhaps in regards to lab-grown protein or other models of making it widely available to large populations?
Okay. So first, to go back on the issue that beef is very expensive. The way in which we produce beef in the United States is we've developed a taste for a certain style. If you go around the world, in point of fact, ruminants, which have the ability to basically eat anything, weeds, bark, whatever, and convert it into edible nourishment. So if you go to India and see the amount of milk protein that's provided to the population, if you took ruminants out of India, it would become a seriously protein-deprived food economy. And so all of that is raised with grasses that grow along the irrigation ditches that go along the roads, that in some cases are the residues from the production of other crops. And so the U.S. government has spent billions of dollars of your tax money trying to figure out a way to convert cellulose into ethanol. People heard of cellulosic ethanol? You get huge grants. There are plants being built to produce cellulosic ethanol that would cost $6 a gallon at your local filling station, but we are obsessed with converting cellulose into energy. Amazingly, nature's already figured out how to do that in the form of either milk or meat. And so I think the first thing I would say is a lot of the land in the world really can't be cultivated. It's too rocky or it's too steep. And so an easy way to harvest photosynthesis in those places is off hillsides using ruminants and then harvesting the milk and feeding it to children and families, and the same thing with the meat. So I'm going to say, excluding the U.S., Canada, and to some degree Australia, 70% of the world's, 75% of the world's beef is produced in a system that I think is very sustainable and is very inexpensive, which is why it's practiced, whether it's in the northern edges of sub-Saharan Africa or all across India or in western China. It is a very inexpensive way to produce energy from photosynthesis in places where there's no other way to capture those calories. That being said, I think the way that our protein will evolve, aquaculture will be a big opportunity because it's so efficient in the conversion to protein. I think appropriate ruminant participation, and I think that you will see, certainly as we have already, an increase in the percentage of all of the grams of protein coming from chicken continuing to go up simply because of the feed efficiency. To the issue of alternative sources of protein, clearly there's a lot of them out there. Soy protein is growing dramatically. It has issues, as they all do. Most of the items that you're seeing that are lab-grown meats, and they've been around for a long time, and they're, brace yourselves, they're fungi, right? And remarkably, they taste incredibly good. The mouthfeel of the best of them, it is a very meat-like experience. And the ability, with the amount of science we have about flavors and savories, that the ability to make them taste good. And so I think we'll continue to see growth in those because they're getting better and better at it. I think part of it's getting past the message. If the FDA makes them label it as fungi, it may not sell all that well. If it is a non-animal-based protein nutrition, maybe you can get people to buy it. The last one I think is algae. And I think a lot of work's going to go on. And the beauty of algae is that you can grow it with brackish water. And clearly we have a lot more salt water than fresh. And so I think that over time we'll see more of our caloric and protein requirements coming from some derivations of algae. Did you buy into my beef story?
I mean, that makes sense. And we don't have areas.
I think it's really important to understand because you go to some of the poorest countries in the world and a really important part of their protein diet is coming from ruminant-derived milk, whether it's goats or milk cows. But it's a big factor, and I think often underappreciated. Yep.
So, talking to the point you made earlier about the water paranoia, do you think we are somewhat close in time to the moment where we can start trading fresh water or having a commodity, a future market for fresh water, for instance? Do you see that coming, or is that too politically incorrect to?
Well, we do, in effect, trade water. So when the Canadians send barley to Saudi Arabia, they're really sending the output of water use to them. Sending the water itself and then producing photosynthetic food at destination would just be too expensive. The evaporative loss and things is so big. So I think moving water for agricultural purposes, I would see that as being unnecessary and, if not unnecessary, way far away. I think the trading of water for urban purposes, I think you could see that beginning to start. And it partly depends on the price of energy. Clearly, a lot of improvements have been made in reverse osmosis, desalination. And so it's kind of a race between the cost of transporting water and the cost of removing salt from water. And at this point, clearly that battle's being won by reverse osmosis. And as long as natural gas, we continue to find it in abundance and things, that I would think that'll continue to be the case. If we're going to have $4, $5, $6 natural gas, I think it's pretty unlikely we'll haul very much water, because it's just cheaper to utilize the great improvements in reverse osmosis. Is that?
So you're the head of this massive global organization with...
There's actually a couple thousand small companies.
Okay.
I always think better thinking about it.
Even more than to my question, what does your day look like? What does your week look like? I would love to just understand what your life is like.
Understanding the high bar. At first, it's a great job, and as in most great jobs, it also has moments that are less enjoyable. But I would guess there's no typical day nor typical week. So in the month of November, I was basically out of the country the whole time. So I was in Africa for a portion of it, in Europe. I was in Colombia, and interestingly, in Colombia, had a chance to go out. Cargill has an entity called Black River Asset Management, which invests some of Cargill's family money and also third-party capital. And they're going out on the eastern savannas of Colombia now that the FARC, or the rebel movement, is stabilized. I wouldn't say it's gone away. When I told the ambassador I'd been out to this farm and told him where it was, he said he is not permitted to go there. I'm not sure I wanted my board to hear that, but I went out. And so this Black River Asset Management and a group of legacy Cargill employees, they bought 52,000 hectares of land. They brought about 5,000 hectares into production. The productivity is incredible. The roads are non-existent. They have to generate all their own electricity. Everybody that's working on the farm is living in metal export containers, including me while I was there. When they close the door on a metal container at night, it's dark. You are completely oblivious to any jet lag. But they are doing things. This land, there is no, for as far as you can see, and I grew up in North Dakota, I know flat, and we don't have that kind of flat. It is one of the flattest places, and we took a single-engine plane and both flew over our farm and the lands around us between these two big rivers that drain into the Orinoco, and it is just the biggest sea of grass that you've ever seen. And there is technology to convert that land into really productive agriculture. So I talked about how far Zambia's come, 5 tons per hectare. This land is raising 10 tons per hectare. The problem with it is the rural sociology is not that great. It's high capital intensity farming done by a big company. Is that how the world's likely to feed itself? If we're in a hurry, it's the best way. But if we're in a hurry, I think we'll end up with all the social issues that are far less attractive. And so I went to see it just to balance it between the way we're going to try to participate in a Ghana or a Zambia or Zimbabwe versus what we're doing there. The good news, if there was one of the Civil War, is basically the FARC drove. There are no people out there to displace. And so the land is in big tracts. We have to bring in all of the workers. In many other parts of the world where we go, big-scale agriculture like that would disrupt and dispossess so many people. It's just not going to be a solution. So we have to have both the big landmass solution and the small one.
So you talked about the comparative advantage and maybe the solutions of it, and economics is always known as the dismal science, and I think maybe some people in the local movement might see that as kind of dismal, that their food would be grown far away even though it's more productive. Do you think the local movement of eating local is sustainable on a global scale, or will it, or really is this comparative advantage the answer for 9 billion people?
Yeah. So first, and it's great that you asked the question because it's a point I should have made back to this group of factoids that should shape your thinking. 85% of the world's calories are consumed in the nation where they're growing. And so the amount of food that trades, and it really hasn't changed that much. Clearly there are small crops like cocoa that are raised in more restricted areas. But if you take all of the world's calories, 85% of them are consumed in the country where they're growing. And so we're talking at the margin into the issue of comparative economics. If I had to look forward to 2050, I would have said that that number may get up around 20. It's going to go up because some people that are raising crops with non-renewing irrigation water, they're going to have to stop because it will not be a choice. And so it's an 80-20 deal. 80% of agriculture, 80% of calories, in my opinion, will continue to be grown locally. Zambia will feed itself. Zimbabwe will clearly feed itself and its neighbors, Mozambique. And so we will see some places that today import food will stop and start appropriately raising their own, and there'll be some other places that are raising their own food inappropriately today that will stop because it's a non-sustainable model, and it will replace. But if it gets to 80-20, 80 local and 20 world traded, I would think that's probably a good guess. So it's a very local business today. So yes, I think local VORs. I smiled though when the New York City Farmers Market, I think it was either last summer, it was the year before, this past summer, they raised the radius of what qualifies as local food to be sold in the farmers market. Why? It was so popular they needed more land. Well, we figured that out 300 years ago. But the point is about what's the definition of local has to be thought about in the context of population density, not in some kind of altruistic view of the world. But yeah, agriculture should be local, and it can be, just not 100% local, or you'd be doing a lot of inappropriate things.
You talk about the pros and cons of running the U.S.'s largest private company. And there's a recent Fortune article talks about kind of a forced sale of Mosaic to fund shareholder needs and kind of the private side of it, but yet you don't deal with kind of the public shareholder element. So what are the things you face that you like and don't like of being private?
No, there was a reporter here, so I was... Huh? He's gone? Oh, you'll enjoy it more then. Okay. No, so what happened in Cargill? First, a little bit about our governance. So 146-year-old company, same family owns it. The employees own a little over 10%, partly through an ESOP that has about 25,000 members, and then part of it is used for management compensation. And the board, so the family owns 90% of the stock, and they get 1/3 of the seats on the board, which is about the opposite of how most entities work. You have people like the Bush family or whatever controlling Budweiser with 4, 5, 6% of the shares. So in Cargill, that's our governance model. We have 92 living shareholders, including, I think our youngest is about 5 months. So yeah. I always joke, I have a picture of one of my shareholders in my wallet. Kid in diapers. But so the family hasn't been particularly prolific when you think 146 years and 92 living shareholders. And now some of them are married and things, but 92 descendants. And so we have stayed private partly as a result of that the company grew faster than the family did. And it allowed the retention of most of the cash flow in the company. So I started in 1974, and everybody will do the math. How long that was before you were born, right? And so in 1974, and in the time I've been there, more than 85% of the cash flow of the company has been left in it. And that doesn't exist very many, in any public companies probably. So what happened is Margaret Cargill never married, and she became our largest shareholder, about 18% of the stock of the company. So she died, she left all of her money to charity, 100%. And so the charity clearly were a restrictive security to own. And so we entered into a 3 or 4 year discussion of how we might allow them to get access to liquidity in order to carry out her charitable wishes. And it took a very long time working with the IRS, working with the banking community, and with our board to come up with a transaction that allowed her to be monetized, in effect, while allowing Cargill to remain private. So a story, one of our shareholders, he's my exact age, and he also sits on our board. So we had some conversation, what does being private mean? Because there are a lot of different definitions. If we control more votes, is that enough to be private? And he said, Greg, I'll tell you what being private is. If I go to the annual meeting and I don't know everybody there, we're not private. It's really easy to understand, right? Okay, I got it. And so I don't know that we're so much compelled in one degree worse. She had died. I mean, in a perfect world for myself, it would have been great if she lived to be 110. But what she'd elected to do with her money and our desire to try to accommodate that, we found a solution with the Mosaic shares. And so we swapped her stock in Cargill for a completely liquid security in the New York Stock Exchange company. And that transaction took place in May of this year. And so I think it's a success story in the end. It's not the way I'd like the world to turn out. And the reason I say it is owning a fertilizer business, which tends to make a lot of money when grain prices are high, and we own a big animal protein business, which tends not to make very much money when grain prices are high. It was a good complement to have those two businesses inside the company. So we lost some diversification. So the value of her stock, I think, was about $7 billion. And so it'll be one of the 10 biggest charities in the United States. And they'll do a lot of good with it. So I'm going to focus on that. Okay, and then I'll go the other side. Okay.
There's a news story the other day about making kind of a worldwide push to make fertilizer less explosive for security, for like more areas. Is that on the radar at all? Or?
Yes. I mean, it clearly is a challenge. In the U.S., it's a very small part. And what he's talking about is the product that was used in the bombing of the Oklahoma City office building was essentially fertilizer and diesel fuel in 50-gallon garbage barrels. And so in the U.S., companies that sell it, and we by and large have quit selling it, and we don't make it. But our grain elevators that supply farmers, basically the only places we ever sold it were to the tobacco farmers, because that kind of fertilizer works particularly well for that agronomy. But today, to my knowledge, in the U.S., we do not sell any ammonium sulfate that I'm aware of. So we have quit. But I think that over time, a lot of other companies have quit, and I think it will be phased out in the U.S. The challenge is it's a relatively inexpensive kind of fertilizer to make. And so to say we've stopped having it in the U.S. and to say the world has decided to quit making it, I think those are going to be separated by a lot of years simply because of the economics. Was that your question? Or?
Yeah, I mean the U.S. and internationally.
Yeah. Okay.
As a leader in this space, to what extent does Cargill feel it has a responsibility to set some of the tone of the public policy conversations? And can you give a few examples of maybe specific ways in which you're doing that?
The self-serving ones or the more noble? I mean, clearly we tried to influence public policy, and because we're in so many countries, we end up doing a lot of it. Part of the reason I was in Colombia was the chance to meet with the government on some issues around their agriculture that we think would be a good idea. And so a lot of them are related to pure commercial interests. I think the biggest area where we try to raise our voice about issues that are bigger than our company and more about our industry, or even more about how do you nourish all the people in the world, a lot of our focus has been on trust-based free trade, trying to make the Doha round be successful, trying to deal with what I'll call government hoarding, which is governments that seeking food security for their population against the best interests of everybody else. And so it's kind of a beggar thy neighbor policy. So I think in water use, in land rights, in Africa, and in the whole trade agenda, I think those are the places where we think our voice is worth something. And so we put a lot of effort into it. We have 6 people in Washington, D.C., just to give a sense of scale. Most of our lobbying is done by people from a given senator's district. So we don't use lobbyists. We have people in Washington that organize the appointments, and we bring. And so if you join Cargill, the odds that you will be there talking to the senator from the state where we have a facility that's impacted by a particular policy, we have tried to use employees. And so what we may lack in terms of being as smooth as a lobbyist, we feel we gain in subject matter knowledge and in an earnest interest in the outcome. And so most of our, quote, lobbying is done by bringing active employees in those businesses in. And we do the same in Europe, same in Beijing, in Brussels. And so we do lobby in the broadest sense, but we tend to do it with active commercial managers.
Given the fact that world population growth is projected to grow, whatever percent going forward, there's also less arable land out there, just with development, soil erosion. So it really comes down to productivity of the land, to sustain ourselves going forward. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that we're seeing on the productivity side? I understand, is it phosphorus that's the main kind of input there? And that's a finite resource.
This is such a great audience because you're bringing up all the right questions.
So just could you talk a little bit about that?
So phosphorus is a great one. Clearly, until we did the transaction with Margaret Cargill, I think we were the world's largest producer of phosphate fertilizer. For most of the time that we owned the company until the biofuels revolution really kicked in 2005, 6, 7, the price of phosphate fertilizer, let's just call it $200 a ton, some years less, some years more. At that point, the best estimates of the commercially recoverable phosphate resources in the world were about 50 years. Okay? In 2008, the price went to $1,100 a ton. What do you think the world's commercially recoverable reserves of phosphate were at $1,100 a ton? Between 12 and 1,400 years. And so it becomes an issue about how price impacts decisions, both about how much fertilizer to use, but also where we might get it. And it's mostly an issue about depth. I have a chance, because we trade a lot of mineral commodities and things, to meet with the leadership of some of the big mining companies, and they always joke. They said, you agricultural guys just don't get it. You think about length times width, because all you can farm is area. He said, we can mine length times width times depth, and so it's cubic. And he gave an example, it happened to be the CEO of Rio Tinto, about one of their biggest iron ore mines. It is a postage stamp sized piece of the earth, and it's one of the largest iron ore mines in the world. You couldn't grow enough grain on that amount of land to feed the people in this room. And so the thing that I have not always appreciated about some of these mineral resources, it's a cost issue. There is enormous quantities of most of these minerals. It's simply what's the price, and therefore how far out into the middle of continents you can go and how deep into the earth you can go, but there's lots of it there. And I think the fertilizer example really makes the point. So think of it as 1,200 years. Okay.
What role do you think some of the biologically engineered crops might play then, if you could engineer one that would need less water or need less phosphorus or something to that effect?
Yeah, they already need less water, and so they've made enormous progress, and they're also much more resistant. The second thing is, by using these technologies, you don't have to plow the soil as much, and so the portion of the world's crops that are grown with no tillage has gone up dramatically. So every time you plow the earth, you turn it over and all the moisture evaporates, so you lose the water. You use diesel fuel to do it. And so the big advantages are less water, less fertilizer, and more importantly, I think a much smaller carbon footprint if you can use these technologies to grow all of our food and do it with less tillage. So.
Which country or geographical area do you think will become the biggest exporter of grains in the foreseeable future? A lot of talks about Argentina. What do you think about it?
Are you Argentine?
No.
Oh, good. Then I'm free to say what I really think. No, that Argentina is probably one of the 4 or 5 most important countries in Cargill, because it's the foundation for a lot of our supply chain. But by just the sheer size of its land mass, it doesn't have the capacity. Basically, the leaves of plants are just photocells, and so it's strictly an issue of area and water. And so when you talk about area and water, Brazil's got significantly more. Now, to turn it around and say which country is likely to produce more calories per hectare of land utilized, then I think Argentina will certainly be in the top handful. So it won't be in total tons, but in terms of productivity, it'll be outstanding. Another advantage that they have in Argentina, which they managed to dissipate through various governmental behaviors, is they raise more food closer to the sea than anywhere else in the world. And so the total transportation cost of the food that comes from Argentina is the lowest in the world. And so they have an enormous comparative advantage, and that won't go away. It's a wonderful thing.
With over $100 billion in revenue, are you, like, how do you manage growth, and what are you focused on? Are you doing it organically? Are you doing acquisitions? And also, like, how do you, in terms of like 3 to 5 year strategy, do you set that? And could you just talk a little bit about that?
We probably set some parameters for our growth and some philosophies. We have said to ourselves that we are better at predicting what skill sets will be important in the future than exactly which countries and which businesses will be good businesses. And so at a level beyond 2 or 3 years, most of our thinking is more about what kind of human capital do we have to get ready, and what kind of attitudes and skill sets and information systems are they going to need to be successful. So it's less about the portfolio and more about the competencies of the organization. Because the family leaves all the money in the company, the good news is we know how much money we can spend, which is a restraint. We don't have access to leverage and things. So we know how much money we can spend. The downside of it is we know how much money we have to spend. And so you have to really stay on the growth path. So the tangible net worth of the company is 70 times what it was when I joined. Okay, so you got to get up every morning thinking about something else to do. and hopefully anybody joining the company now will have the same experience. And so we clearly have a lot of opportunity just to do what we do some places and do it in more places. And that will be part of it, and some will be new businesses. I was in, Mike, help me, some of you were in the class today, and they talked about the Tata and the Jaguar case, and it made me think, we just bought Unilever's tomato salsa business in Brazil. So it's store brands, they have the leading brand, 40-some% market share. Okay, it's an expansion for us. We have tended to be a B2B company, and this is a B2C endeavor. My phone rang off the hook from customers of ours saying, are you going to become my biggest competitor? And so we're somewhat restrained in what businesses we can get into by our relationship with the Nestle's and people like that. And so we really see ourselves as a B2B customer. We have convinced people that having B2C skills is important to serving them better. And it helped that we bought it from Unilever. The one thing I didn't say in the class that I would say to you is beware of carve-outs. They know more about who the most talented people are than you do. And after you buy a carve-out, the best R&D people and the best marketing people aren't there. So, I mean, we knew it was going to happen. We didn't know the degree to which it was going to happen. But so, and to finish your question, up until this year, we'd probably reinvested 95% of our CapEx through organic growth, pouring cement and building facilities. This past year, we ended up making some acquisitions, but particularly during the private equity era, we just lost bid after bid. But the historical business model for Cargill, because we're trying to grow about 3 times the speed of global GDP, the historical model is about 40 to 45% of our capital would best be deployed through acquisitions. And we were down to virtually 0 for almost 4 years, which really changed the skill set that we needed, because we don't have enough engineers to spend 100% of our cash flow pouring cement. It takes a lot of people. Yep. Hi.
One of the large groups that's fighting the Keystone Pipeline are the Nebraska grain producers, because they're worried about the water supply being polluted in a spill. As both a transportation company and obviously a buyer of grain, does Cargill have a position on the Keystone Pipeline, and if so, why?
I think how it's built and the exact path of it is something that should be discussed. I think the idea that you're going to stop the Canadians from exploiting the tar sands by prohibiting that pipeline is naive, and I think the alternative that would come from continued obstinate would be that they will go to the West Coast with it, and I think we'll all be worse off. So we haven't come out publicly. I mean, I think clearly the Sandhills, if you've ever been to the Sandhills in Nebraska, they're a unique place, and I think that there may have to be some thought given, but there are clearly tens of thousands of miles of pipeline in the United States. that have been operated safely. So I think the debate should be more about the how and perhaps some modification to the route. But my concern is that too much of the resistance is a function of believing that you can stop the tar sands by stopping that pipeline. And I just don't believe that that'll be the case. But we have not weighed in. We would not, there'd be no upside for that. I get enough bad emails already. I had an NGO the other day, they dropped off a box of signatures and letters on my front step. You know, they could have just mailed them, so I can only presume they came to my house to prove they knew where my house was. So, either that or the Postal Service is really falling down. I don't know what that is. Yeah?
So I have a question just elaborating on your point about sort of skill sets. You talked about how your commercial managers are actually having to go to Washington and lobby or present their educate policymakers. And I guess how do you see sort of that evolving skill set in terms of, you know, you're talking about knowledge of free trade, cultural economics, how policymakers make decisions. Those are classically not traits found in business leaders. So how are you thinking through those skill sets and how you deal with those cross-functional requirements?
Yeah. So I think, as I said, we have 6 people there and their job. And if your goal isn't to write the legislation, and really the number one thing that we worry about is unintended consequences. Back to this compartmentalization of policy. Surprisingly, second-order consequences is not a broadly practiced skill set. And so a lot of times it's simply saying, if you do this, they all do static analysis, and they don't think about what it will do the next year and the next year and the next year. And so one thing our people are very good at is second and third order consequences. And so we don't try to put them in a situation where they're trying to talk about or give input on things where they're not completely comfortable. But second and third order consequences, they're very good at it because they know how American farmers or American ranchers or American food companies will respond to a given set of legislation. And I think you can come as a what I would call as a honest broker of information. I had a senator, I don't know, it's probably 8 or 9 months ago now, we were there on an issue, and he said, Greg, why is it every time you come here you say things different than your competitors? Geez, that hadn't been my plan. But, and I think the reason is because we're in all parts of the value chain, a lot of the people we compete with are only doing one thing. So if you are only a livestock producer, you are going to lobby in a certain way. In our case, we can't lobby the way a livestock producer does, or we would be in trouble with every grain farmer that does business with us or every food company that buys our food ingredients. And so some of the need to be an honest broker of these second and third order consequences is forced on us by being diverse across the value chain, because we don't have the luxury of having a single righteous view of things, because that righteousness would get us in trouble with some other link in the value chain. Last question, dreaded. Usually don't get it. All right.
Talking about water quality and phosphates and putting the two together. Here in Virginia, we're struggling with fertilizer runoff from farms in the Chesapeake Bay. How do you think we can balance the needs of ensuring food security with preserving our waterways?
So the answers to those questions, there are some watersheds where the soil type is probably more difficult, but in most of the places that we're involved, we don't happen to be in the Delmarva Peninsula, but clearly we have some of the same issues in parts of Oklahoma and things. And it goes back to the don'ts, is that if the cheapest way to get nutrients for your pastures is to buy chicken litter, unless there's a governance model in place to control that, the temptation for any individual participant to maybe use more than they should is going to happen. And so I think the issue goes back to the don'ts in the policy. The science exists to know how to manage those issues, and the will has to be there, and clearly some people's business models will be impaired or impaled by those decisions. But invariably where we've seen the trouble is over-application that leads to the leaching. And so I want to be careful here, because there are some people that have soil types that are particularly conducive to leaching and the problem you're talking about. But as an industry, It's just, it has to be dealt with, right? It's not that we don't know how. Some people may have to haul their litter far further than they planned, but that was a decision they took when they decided to locate there. And not to, and certainly the people that raise livestock in Delmarva are good customers of Cargill's, but at some point there are only so many livestock that can be contained in an area that small, and to do it responsibly. And I think those decisions over time are going to get made. But I can't believe, with all the things we know and the obvious nature of the problem, that it's going to be allowed to persist. So it will get addressed, and some people won't like it. And we've had to change our practices. All right, I said.
One personal question. So, having worked with the same company for over 30 years, for almost 40 years.
You're going to keep criticizing?
I think it's either boring or exciting experience.
Yeah.
But looking back, like, do you think there are different stages in your career?
Yes.
And what are those stages? Like, you feel you have advanced to another level, or you have new perspective about your personal
It's basically been given many opportunities to do jobs for which you're not prepared. And so, I have. I've moved 9 different times. I spent 6.5 years living in Asia. I've had a chance to take over businesses that other people ran. I had a chance to start a business for Cargill. I worked in our financial trading business, so it hasn't been boring, certainly, but there have been a lot of different stages. Good. Thanks everyone for your questions.